Hello and welcome to the Voice of TOD. I'm Tom, and in this video we're going to talk about Fear Street Part 2, 1978, the 2021 movie and second part in a trilogy of horror movies coming to Netflix. But first, these reviews don't contain spoilers. So you're safe to watch this before you see the film if you want, and as I say, this movie is on Netflix right now if you want to check it out. First, let's get the admin out the way. So the film is directed by Lee Janek of Honeymoon and Fear Street 1994, and is written by Janek, Zach Olkowitz and Phil Graziadei of Honeymoon and Fear Street 1994, and is based on the novel series by R.L. Stine, who also wrote the Goosebumps novels. The movie stars Sadie Sink as Ziggy Berman, Emily Rudd as Cindy Berman, McCabe Sly as Tommy, Ted Sutherland as young Nick Good, and some returning faces from the first film. The synopsis from IMDb. Shadyside, 1978. School's out for summer and the activities at Camp Nightwing are about to begin. But when another Shadysider is possessed with the urge to kill, the fun in the sun becomes a gruesome fight for survival. So with the admin out the way, let's dive into what I thought. This is a trilogy. If you haven't had a chance to see my review for part 1, it will be at the end of this video. Check it out if you're interested, but I'll just give you a quick overview now. So, part 1 surprised me. It doesn't go as hard on the gore as I would have liked, but this trilogy is rated 15 in the UK at least, so I gave it a pass. The thing that really stood out to me was the soundtrack, and that seems to be a running theme here, because the highlight for me in this movie was the soundtrack and the sound editing. So let's start there. I love my 70s classic rock, and this soundtrack has it all. From Bowie, Twice, Cat Stevens, Buzzcocks, Blue Oyster Cult, Kansas, and so many more. We even get a little bit of Nirvana covering a Bowie song at the beginning of the movie. Really, the soundtracks have made these films for me. I'd have probably just not really bothered with them, but they hit you with some great music at the start, and it just keeps you going through regardless of, I guess, what's going on the screen. The music and the sound editing is fantastic. So yes, big thumbs up from me, because I'm really impressed in at least that side of this. I have mentioned that this movie is split. We get brief moments bookending this from the returning characters of the last movie. That's really just to keep this continuing, to link this to the last film, and really just keep the trilogy moving along. For me it works. I get the feeling that parts 1 and 2 are going to build up to something big in part 3, where hopefully all of the questions will be answered. Based on that idea, part 2 does a good enough job of keeping you entertained and interested in what's the overall story, I think. Does fill in some of the blanks from part 1, and it does open up a few new questions which hopefully we'll get the answers to. The bulk of the movie is set during the killings at the summer camp, and the main characters, they are again mostly unfamiliar to me. Kind of as you expect. Again, this is a teen horror movie. Most of the actors are teens or young adults, whatever. Not really actors I'm familiar with, outside of Sadie Sink, obviously Stranger Things 3, and Ted Sutherland, who some of you may know as the voice of Jack Marsden in Red Dead Redemption 2. Again, no real standouts like the first film, but they're all good enough. It works well enough to keep you entertained, I'm going to say. The story itself is fine. It's about as good as the first. I think it sticks much more rigidly to the idea of your 70s slasher horror nostalgia. Again, it does nothing new. At this point, I think the first one, just to bring people in, part 1 doesn't have to reinvent the wheel. But part 2 needs to do something interesting to really hook you in that little bit more. I don't think that this movie does that. I think that's a big failing, especially with part 2, where you can kind of take a few risks. Part of the problem with that, I think, is the releasing structure. This is released a week after the first one, and the only real difference that I could tell is the setting. This is now in the 70s. That's it, really. There isn't enough to differentiate part 1 and part 2, in my head at least. They do shy away from showing a lot of the killings as well. There would be much more gruesome in this. There are scenes in part 1 that are very full on, and again, it's that quick cutting away, very clever with what they show. I think part 2 really misses that. I don't think part 2 is anywhere near as gory as the first, and there is some really awkward scenes in there. The one that stood out to me was the sex scene. This is probably because of the actor's age, but it was so clearly focused on not showing any nudity that it just made this film feel much more watered down with the lack of gore and the kill shot, I guess. I think that a lot of that was lost, maybe in the edit, but it took away from the impact of the film for me. I mentioned the first was baby's first horror. I use the term affectionately. This is so much more on the nose with that. I think anybody sort of my age or around my age grew up with the 70s slasher films. This tries to do that. Maybe your entry point into horror, like the first one was, and a little nod to that. So you'd watch this and then you think, oh, the inspiration was Texas Chainsaw Massacre. I'll go watch that. I don't know. It's probably more just a nod because, the writing team loved those kind of films. But this struggles under the weight, I think, of that nostalgia and the praise that people have for that genre of horror film. And part 2, honestly, is just less interesting. With it being the weaker movie and them coming out so quickly, so part 3 is out tomorrow at time of recording, I think part 3 needs to do something really clever, or at least throw some new light on the stories going on in 1 and 2. I'm still interested to see what they do with it. I think the most interesting thing for me is what they'll do with the music, because the music has been so focused on the decades that these movies are meant to be set in. With a few exceptions, of course, but I'm not really sure what bangers came out in 1666. We'll see. I will be reviewing part 3 over the weekend, so keep an eye out for that if these horror films are something of interest to you. And if you've enjoyed this review, do subscribe to the channel for more movie and game news, reviews, anything else I want to talk about. We're going to do quite a lot over the weekend. I've got a couple of reviews. We're going to get some live streams in. Speaking of live streams, you can check out Todd Plays Games for all of the Let's Plays. There's about 20 hours of Divinity Original Sin on there, and you can find all the mistakes that I've made. It's quite funny. So if you want to catch up before we play some more of that next week, that was the perfect time. Links in the description below. And if you want to know when new videos drop, hit the bell or follow me on social media. But as always, thank you for watching. I'll see you in the next one.